next week is May 1st, International Workers' Day. This is a holiday in most countries across the world. It remembers and commemorates workers' struggle, the martyrs of Chicago who went on strike demanding an 8-hour workday. Interestingly enough, in the United States, it is actually not a holiday. However, in recent years, May 1st, Mayday, International Workers' Day, has been gaining importance in the labor struggle and the labor movement. More and more unions and people have called on May Day as a day of struggle, calling on people to go on strike. This year, of course, in the context of resistance to Trump, it's gained even more importance. So to talk about upcoming actions for May Day and what it means for the movement of working people in the United States, we are happy to be joined by Husayn Karimi. He's the editor of Labor on the Line, and he's going to break down what's happening and what comes next. So, Husayn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, as I said, despite the fact that May Day is not a recognized holiday in the United States, we're seeing that many organizations and trade unions have vowed to make it a day of struggle, to walk off their job, no school, no work, no shopping. Can you give us an overview of what to expect next week and the significance of this mobilization?
Yeah, for sure. Well, as you said, there are hundreds of protests and demonstrations and rallies and marches that are being planned for May 1st under the banner of Workers Over Billionaires. And, Trump's first term has been marked by attack after attack and also major resistance. These No King's Days demonstrations that have happened in June of last year, October of last year, and then again March of this year have seen millions of people taking to the streets. And in a lot of ways, May 1st is a sort of continuation of this mass movement against the Trump administration. But what makes it different is that it's on a Friday. And in many parts, unlike the previous No King's Days, which were on Saturdays, and in many parts of the country, there are midday actions where workers, students, teachers of all stripes are taking to the streets under the banner of not only Workers Over Billionaires, but using the tactic that was popularized in Minnesota of no work, no school, no shopping. And the other element here that I think is important to point out, which you referenced, is that May 1st is International Workers' Day, which is really inspired by the general strike for the 8-hour workday in the United States on May 1st, 1886. And the national center of that movement was in Chicago. About 1% of the population struck nationwide that day, which would be around 3 million people today. And the fact that the spirit of May Day is being revived again here in the United States, where the story really started, a holiday which, as you said, is recognized and celebrated with huge marches all across the world, speaks to the moment we're in the United States. And then, of course, on top of that, the fact that this tactic of no work, no school, no shopping is being popularized nationwide is hugely significant.
Well, you mentioned it a little, but I wanted to, remind people that once again, May Day remembers this struggle in Chicago, where workers went out on strike for the 8-hour workday. A lot of things, something today that many workers can appreciate, given that we do not have to work for 10 hours, 12 hours, 14 hours. This was a product of that strike in Chicago, the martyrs of Haymarket. It was about demanding better conditions in facing this brutal repression. And in the past year, as you said, the concept of a general strike, the general strike, which we saw, showcased in Chicago over 100 years ago, has come into popular political discourse, as you mentioned, whether it's from Minnesota, where people went out on strike on January 23rd and the 30th against ICE terror. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson calling for a general strike at one of the No King's Day protests. So talk a little more about this concept of the general strike as a tool. When has it been used in the United States, and what does it mean for U.S. workers to even be talking about the possibility of a general strike.
Yeah, well, there hasn't really been a general strike in this country since December of 1946 in Oakland, until January of this year in Minnesota, which changed everything. And prior to that, and prior to 1946, was the general strike wave in 1934 in Toledo and San Francisco and in Minneapolis. But from 1946, and I would also add 2006, which was a day without an immigrant, and historically is now referenced, I think, correctly as a nationwide general strike, at least a particular section of the working population. It's sort of been semi-extinguished as a popular tactic and the most powerful tactic of working people to resist the attacks of the wealthy and the politicians. And I want to speak a little bit about Minnesota, which I was there. I know a number of BT journalists were on the ground as well. It
Braving the
was a
cold.
moment very, very cold, -20. Not enough people talk about how cold it was on January 23rd. I know the two of us were worried about turnout, but the people of Minnesota apparently are just built that much
Built
different
different.
when 100,000 people took to the streets. But it was a time where the moment in January looked a lot different than today, and our understanding of the Trump administration and its attacks and the resistance to it. It looked like Trump wasn't going to be stopped for many people across the country. I
Mhm.
think many people also had a lot of hope in the movement, but for many people, it was the strategy of flooding the zone, of attacking on so many different fronts to overwhelm any possible resistance in any form seemed to be working. And that whole image of invincibility was shattered in
Mhm.
Minnesota. And the way it was shattered was after the announcement of Operation Metro Surge, which saw the biggest DHS operation commence in the Twin Cities and across the state, thousands upon thousands of ICE and CBP officers just terrorizing communities, both immigrant and non-immigrant citizens in the state, was met with huge resistance. The day after Nicole Renee Good, and it really culminated with the murder of Nicole Renee Good and its subsequent response, tens of thousands of people took to the streets that week, every day. And then a coalition of faith organizations, unions, community organizations called for January 23rd to be a day of no work, no school, and no shopping. And people organized can mass canvases, organized their coworkers, organized press conferences, and ultimately 100,000 people took to the streets in what was the first general strike since 2006, and before then, since 1946 in Oakland in the United States. And not only was it a general strike in the Twin Cities that was what made it significant, it became popularized across the country. People saw that this is the way forward. This is how we can defeat the Trump administration. And that point was made only more clear after Alex Preddy was murdered the day after January 23rd. And
Mhm.
the community of Minnesota and the country was even more outraged. And people started talking about the need to expand the general strike, not just in Minnesota and have another shutdown in Minnesota, but to generalize it all across the country, which is exactly what happened. On January 30th, another 100,000 people took to the streets in Minnesota, and other cities all across the country joined in. They wanted to be like Minnesota. And just a few days after January 30th, where the general strike movement began to shake the country, Tom Homan and the Trump administration announced the conclusion of Operation Metro Surge, which arguably is one of the biggest political defeats of Trump's second term. And at its core, the concept of the general strike speaks to the centrality and power of ordinary people, working people, to shape and make history. And that's increasingly becoming the sort of tactical horizon of the movement. What the Trump administration and really both parties fear most is that workers will feel the political strength that is held in our labor power. That's really the power of the general strike. And ultimately, it was too costly for the Trump administration to allow for that concept to take root across the country that led to the end of Operation Metro Surge. But
Yeah,
it's
I
too
think
late to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak.
definitely. And I think it's really important that you mention that sequence of events, and especially the forced withdrawal of federal agents from Minnesota. I think now, again, we really take for granted that since those mass mobilizations took place in Minnesota, we have actually not seen another operation of its type. People will remember that preceding the deployment of 2,000 and then another 1,000 federal agents to Minnesota, there had been similar style operations in North Carolina, in New Orleans, in Los Angeles. And since Minnesota, the Trump administration, and we know this from New York Times reports, from investigative reports, the Trump administration has completely shifted its immigration strategy. It knows that it is extremely unpopular and will meet mass resistance if it does try to take on another like mass, very visible deployment in a city like Minnesota. So I think that also has to be mentioned there. But Husayn, you bring up this concept. Well, maybe you didn't name it, but kind of this idea of infectious bravery. People saw what was happening in Minnesota. They saw people taking to the streets. And this spread like wildfire. This idea that normal people from all walks of life could confront the Trump administration and its policies in a collective way, in a general strike, in a mass mobilization. So, when we look at this May 1st, I think it will also have a similar impact. So I was wondering if you could share some of the stories that you've heard. We know this May Day is going to be, its protagonists are nurses, our teachers, our students. Maybe share some of those stories that you've heard about why people are joining May Day, International Workers' Day. What's motivating them?
Well, people are just outraged by the attacks from the Trump administration and the current state of the country, frankly, and a lack of resistance from politicians who position themselves to be opposed to Trump but aren't doing much at all. And coming to the realization that if we want to make some changes, not only stop the attacks from the Trump administration, but to fight for the things that have been denied to us for so long, like healthcare and education and housing, we have to take matters into our own hands as working people and as people in general. People are fed up with the cost of living, the budget cuts to education and healthcare and social services that are now just starting to set in a real way. People are fed up with the totally unjustified and illegal war on Iran that's costing US taxpayers billions of dollars a day. Those are the stories that I'm hearing that are inspiring and motivating people to take actions that, in another moment, and absent of the story and reference point, as you said, that was set by Minnesota, may be really challenging to take because those types of workplace actions come with a lot of fear, frankly.
Mhm.
They're serious actions, but people are fed up, and at a certain point, the cost of inaction is larger than the cost of action, and that's what drives people into the streets. So all over the country, workers and students of all backgrounds are building up towards May Day. And in certain parts of the country, workers aren't going to go to work. And to name a few of those places, in North Carolina, for instance, the North Carolina Association of Educators have called for teachers to participate in the midday action in Raleigh, North Carolina, and have successfully, from what I've can tell, are successfully shutting down many districts, school districts in the state of North Carolina. The same is happening in Wisconsin. Just yesterday, the Madison Teachers Association put out a press release saying that a vast majority of their members voted to participate in May Day, which in Madison, Wisconsin is a midday action, and they're going to be taken to the streets with their students. In Chicago, who you all have been covering quite a bit and had the president of the Chicago Teachers Union, Stacey Davis Gates, on last week, of course, was able to, through lots of organizing, pressure Chicago public schools to make May 1st a civic day of action. And CPS is not only allowing people to participate, but sending buses to schools to allow for teachers and students to go downtown and participate in the midday action. Service workers in the South are organizing, talking to their coworkers about participating from Mississippi to Atlanta to North Carolina and Durham. So the actions, I would say there's variation. Not everyone is necessarily going to not work, but will be participating in some day of action, whether it's at 1 p.m. or 5 p.m. But to come back to my earlier point, I think the real victory of a mass demonstration on May 1st is the revival of International Workers' Day and all the radical history associated with it, and the popularization of the concept of the general strike, which is the most powerful weapon that working people have in this country.
And Husayn, before we let you go, what comes next? Is it the midterms in November? What are people building towards right now?
Well, I think the movement in 2006 is really instructive. There was this mass movement to defeat the Sensenbrenner bill, which would have made being undocumented in the US or assisting an undocumented person in the US a felony. And ultimately, it was defeated. How was it defeated? It was defeated because of a huge mass movement that culminated with the May 1st Day Without an Immigrant, when millions of workers, both documented and undocumented, took to the streets. And because of this mass movement, the conversation shifted entirely about how there needed to be comprehensive immigration reform, which was even being considered in the Senate after May 1st and advanced by people like John McCain and Ted Kennedy. And it even passed the Senate 62 to 36, what was called the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act. There are lots of problems with it that we don't necessarily need to get into on the show. And it didn't end up passing the House. But my point is, the mass movement totally changed what was possible and what was being discussed in the country at the time. Not only did it defeat the Sensenbrenner bill, but the entire conversation shifted. But then the illusion that started to be spread from the politicians is we've done what we can in the streets, and now we should leave it to the Democrats. We should leave it to the Democrats. The Democrats ended up winning control of the House and the Senate in 2006, and then they won control of the White House in 2008, and they never passed it. They said they would make it a priority, even though they said they would pass it. They would make it a priority, and they didn't pass it. And now it's been an additional 20 years from 2006 to 2026 without any sort of legalization, which was one of the central demands of the movement at the time. It's been 40 years since there was a wide-scale legalization of undocumented workers in this country, which is why we see these deportations and self-deportations of people who have been in the United States for decades. And we can see the same parallel right now. Minnesota has created this huge blowback. Mayday is coming back as the idea of the power that working people have to take things in our own hands. We have the power to defeat the Trump agenda. But the only real solution is continuing the mass movement and winning what has been denied to us for so long. Minnesota showed us that the mass movement is the greatest way to restrain Trump, and the solution is to continue building that movement because ultimately, Trump is still in office for 2 more years. Even if he would be restrained with a Democratic victory in the House and the Senate, we can't rely on those victories to restrain Trump and to fight for things beyond the status quo that so many people are frustrated with and ultimately led to Trump's victory.
Well, Husayn Karimi, thank you so much. Where can we find your work? Where can we find Labor on the Line?
You can go to our website at laborontheline.org. On all social media pages, we're at Labor on the Line, and follow, share, like our content.
Great. Thank you so much, Husayn, for joining us. And we'll be following Labor on the Line next week, of course, for all of the Mayday updates and following those demonstrations that you mentioned.
Appreciate you. Thanks so much for having me.